They say a home is not merely a structure of brick and mortar, but a sanctuary built from memories, a fortress fortified by love and sacrifice. We spend our lives strengthening its walls against the storms of the outside world, believing it to be impenetrable. But the deepest cracks, the ones that threaten to bring the entire structure down, often come not from a battering ram at the gate, but from the quiet, insidious poison of a viper we willingly invited across the threshold. For Eleanor Vance, a widow of 70, her home was the last testament to a life lived with her late husband, Richard. Every creak of the floorboards was a whisper from the past, every sunbeam that filtered through the living room window, a warm memory of shared laughter. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as she sat gazing at the rose bushes Richard had planted, the world felt steady, peaceful, and hers. Then, the doorbell rang. On her porch stood her daughter-in-law, Isabella, her smile as bright and polished as ever. But next to her was a man Eleanor had never seen, a man in a stiff suit holding a leather portfolio. There was an unnerving finality in his posture. Isabella's voice, usually a melody of sweet affection, was now clipped, businesslike. She held out a sheaf of papers, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the familiar comfort of the home around them. "Eleanor," she said, the name sounding foreign and cold. "This is a notary public. And this," she tapped a finger on the top page, "is a quitclaim deed. The house is legally mine, and Liam's now." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, hanging in the still afternoon air. Then they sank in, sharp and icy, plunging deep into Eleanor's heart. The notary cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. Isabella's smile never faltered, but it no longer reached her eyes. In its place was a chilling gleam of triumph. "We've decided we need the space to start our own family, properly. You have 1 week to gather your things." Shock was too small a word for the chasm that opened beneath Eleanor. It was a silent, complete shattering of her reality. In that moment, she didn't see a conniving daughter-in-law. She saw the ghost of her son's trust, the weaponization of his love, all culminating in this quiet, brutal eviction. The fortress had not been stormed. The gate had been opened from the inside, by the very people she was meant to protect. And as she stood there, silenced by the sheer audacity of the betrayal, Eleanor Vance knew that the war for her life, for the memory of her husband, had just begun. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the woman at its center. Eleanor Vance was not a creature of high drama or loud proclamations. Her life, much like her former profession as a research librarian, was built on a foundation of quiet observation, meticulous order, and a profound respect for the stories that objects and people held. After her husband Richard passed, her world, once a vibrant duet, had softened into a solitary, gentle hum. This quiet was not one of loneliness, but of peaceful companionship with the life they had built. Her home, a sturdy colonial on a tree-lined street in Connecticut, was her co-author in this final chapter. She and Richard had designed it themselves, argued over blueprints at the kitchen table, and hammered in the first and last nails of the back deck. The grain of the oak banister held the memory of her son, Liam's small hands sliding down it. The faint scent of pipe tobacco still clung to the velvet of Richard's armchair, and the garden was a living tapestry of their 35 years together. The house was not an asset. It was an archive of a life, a sacred space where every corner held a story, and Eleanor was its devoted custodian. Her son, Liam, was the best story she had ever produced. He had inherited Richard's kind heart and Eleanor's contemplative nature. As an architect, he saw the world in lines, structures, and potential. He didn't just design buildings, he envisioned homes, spaces where lives would unfold. He was a dreamer, an idealist who believed in the inherent goodness of a well-designed plan, whether on paper or in people. His love for his mother was genuine and deep, a comfortable, time-worn bond of shared history and mutual respect. Yet, his idealism was also his greatest vulnerability. He saw the best in people, sketching out their virtues in his mind while erasing any signs of a flawed foundation. He trusted too easily, loved too wholly, and believed that the beauty he saw on the surface must surely extend all the way to the core. He was a wonderful son and a perfect mark. Isabella Rossi entered their lives not like a person, but like a weather event. She was a whirlwind of dazzling smiles, infectious laughter, and intoxicating energy. Liam met her at a professional mixer, where she, a rising star in a high-end real estate firm, had captivated the room. She was beautiful, but it was her intense focus that was truly magnetic. When she spoke to Liam, it was as if no one else existed. She didn't just listen to his dreams of designing sustainable, community-focused architecture. She absorbed them, reflected them back at him, amplified and validated. She spoke his language, admired his soul, and within weeks had seamlessly integrated herself into the very blueprint of his future. The romance was breathtakingly fast. Liam, who had always been cautious in love, was utterly swept away. He brought her home to meet Eleanor after only a month, presenting her with a triumphant flourish, his eyes shining with a kind of desperate joy. Eleanor, for her part, wanted to love her. She saw how happy Liam was, how he seemed to stand taller, laugh louder, and live more vividly in Isabella's presence. On the surface, Isabella was the perfect daughter-in-law. She arrived with expensive flowers, complimented Eleanor's home with an expert's eye, and called her Mom by the end of their first dinner together. She was charming, intelligent, and unfailingly attentive. The wedding was planned in a flurry of excitement, a lavish affair that took place just 6 months after they had met. It was beautiful, a storybook event. Yet, even amidst the celebration, Eleanor felt a quiet, persistent hum of unease, a single discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. The cracks at first were nearly invisible, the kind you dismiss as imperfections in your own perception. Isabella told a charming story about learning to bake in her grandmother's Vermont farmhouse, but a few weeks later mentioned her severe childhood allergies that prevented her from ever being near a farm. When Eleanor gently pointed it out, Isabella laughed it off, a tinkling, dismissive sound. "Oh, you know me, Mom. I'm always mixing up my stories," she'd said, and Liam had squeezed her hand, looking at her with pure adoration, as if her flaws were just another facet of her charm. Then there was the matter of her family. Isabella spoke of them often. A large, boisterous Italian family. Yet at the wedding, her side of the aisle was sparsely populated by a few stylish friends and a distant cousin who seemed to know very little about her. When asked, Isabella's eyes would mist over as she spoke of a tragic falling out, a story of pride and misunderstanding that made Liam protective and Eleanor quietly suspicious. She claimed to adore the historic charm of Eleanor's home, but her compliments were always tinged with the language of commerce. "This place has such good bones," she'd say, her eyes scanning the crown molding. "The property value in this neighborhood has just skyrocketed. It's a gold mine." Eleanor tried to silence the librarian in her head, the part of her that cross-referenced facts and searched for primary sources. She told herself this was jealousy, the classic, ugly trope of a mother unable to let her son go. She saw the pure, unadulterated happiness in Liam's eyes and decided that it was a price worth paying for her own peace of mind. She would ignore the inconsistencies. She would smother her doubts with affection. She would choose to believe in the beautiful facade Isabella presented, because to do otherwise would be to suggest that her brilliant, wonderful son was a fool. And so, Eleanor smiled. She hosted celebratory dinners, and she welcomed the deceptive angel into her home, all while the quiet hum of wrongness grew steadily louder, a silent alarm counting down to the moment the entire structure would collapse. The first sign that the foundation of her life was shifting came not with a tremor, but with the arrival of boxes, dozens of them. They filled the hallways, their cardboard sides emblazoned with the sleek logo of a high-end moving company. Isabella and Liam were moving in. It had been presented to Eleanor as a wonderful, practical solution. Liam had argued that with the city housing market being so volatile, and with Eleanor all alone in such a big house, it only made sense for them to consolidate, to become a proper family under one roof. It was a logical argument, one Eleanor couldn't refute without sounding selfish. So she had smiled and agreed, and watched as Isabella's world began to methodically overwrite her own. The air in the house changed almost immediately. The familiar, comforting scent of old books and lemon polish was now perpetually tinged with Isabella's expensive, cloying perfume. The quiet hum of the old refrigerator, a sound as constant as Eleanor's own breathing, was drowned out by the thumping bass of Isabella's workout music in the mornings. Isabella's campaign began subtly, a war waged not with open hostility, but with the insidious tyranny of good taste. Her first target was Richard's armchair. It was a large, worn, burgundy velvet chair that sat by the fireplace, its arms faded and its cushion permanently indented with the shape of the man who had sat there every evening for 30 years. To Eleanor, it was the heart of the room. To Isabella, it was an eyesore. "Oh, Mom," she'd said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "That old thing is just a dust magnet. It's probably terrible for your allergies." Before Eleanor could protest, Isabella had already found its replacement online. A sterile, white leather creation that looked more like a piece of modern art than a piece of furniture. It was cold, uncomfortable, and completely out of place, a gleaming white wound in the center of the living room. When Liam came home, Isabella presented it as a thoughtful gift for his mother's health. He had beamed, praising his wife's generosity, and Eleanor had simply nodded, feeling the first sharp pang of erasure. The chair was just the beginning. The erasure spread like a stain. Photographs of Richard on the mantelpiece began a slow, sad migration. First, they were grouped together to make room for a minimalist sculpture Isabella had bought. Then, they were moved to a less conspicuous side table to accommodate a towering orchid. Finally, Eleanor came downstairs one morning to find the mantelpiece bare, save for the sculpture and the orchid. When she asked, her voice trembling slightly, Isabella produced a stack of new, matching silver frames. "I thought we could create a proper family photo wall in the upstairs hallway," she announced brightly. "A fresh start for our new family." The implication was clear. The old family, the one that included the home's builder and Eleanor's husband, was now a matter of historical record, to be filed away in an upstairs gallery. The psychological warfare was even more cunning. Isabella began to treat Eleanor like a charming but increasingly forgetful child. Small objects would go missing: Eleanor's reading glasses, her favorite fountain pen, the remote control. Eleanor would search for them, growing more and more flustered, only for Isabella to produce the item from an obvious place. "Here they are, Mom, right on the coffee table where you left them," she would say, her tone a perfect blend of patience and pity, always in front of Liam. Liam would then look at his mother with a new, worried expression, the seed of doubt about her competence having been expertly planted. Conversations were twisted with the same deft skill. If Eleanor mentioned the garden needed weeding, Isabella would later report to Liam with a sigh, "Your mom is so worried about the garden. I feel terrible that my work schedule keeps me so busy. She must feel like I'm not pulling my weight." What began as a simple statement of fact from Eleanor was spun into an accusation, casting Isabella as the dedicated, misunderstood victim and Eleanor as the demanding, passive-aggressive matriarch. The ultimate goal, Eleanor soon realized, was to sever the deep, intuitive connection she had with her son. Isabella became the gatekeeper of their communication. She would answer Liam's calls on her own phone, relaying messages that were subtly altered in their tone and content. She planned their weekends with a relentless efficiency, always with activities wine tasting, couples yoga, gallery openings that were implicitly not for a woman of Eleanor's age. "We don't want to bore you, Mom," she'd chirp, kissing Eleanor's cheek before steering Liam out the door. The house, once a shared space of comfort, now had invisible walls. The kitchen, once Eleanor's undisputed domain, became Isabella's showroom for new gadgets and complex recipes Eleanor had never heard of. The study, Richard's sanctuary, was rebranded as a home office for Isabella, its warm, wood-paneled walls soon covered in whiteboards filled with sales targets and commission goals. Eleanor found herself retreating more and more to her bedroom, a stranger in her own home, listening to the muffled sounds of the life her son was now living without her. She was witnessing a systematic dismantling of her existence, and the most painful part was that it was all being done with a smile. To protest would be to confirm the narrative Isabella was writing for her, that of a bitter, jealous old woman, unable to adapt to change. And so, Eleanor remained silent, her silence a shield, her observation a sharpening stone. The cracks were no longer subtle. They were gaping fissures in the walls of her home, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the entire structure was being deliberately weakened, prepared for a final, devastating collapse. The weapon of choice in this quiet domestic war was not a blade or a bullet, but a stack of paper, and the moment of its deployment was chosen with the precision of a master strategist. For 2 months, Liam had been living in a self-imposed prison of work. His firm had been awarded the contract for a new city museum, a career-defining project that was both a dream and a monster. It consumed his days and devoured his nights. The dining room table, once a place for family meals, had become a chaotic landscape of architectural drawings, foam models, and empty coffee mugs. He worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by caffeine and the desire to create something truly magnificent. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a blueprint, his thoughts a constant monologue of load-bearing walls, spatial dynamics, and aesthetic integrity. He was brilliant, he was driven, and he was profoundly, dangerously exhausted. Isabella, throughout this period, was the very picture of a supportive spouse. She was his silent partner in the nocturnal hours, his ever-present source of encouragement. She would appear at his side at 2 a.m, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, her touch on his shoulder, a soft reminder that he was not alone. She'd murmur words of admiration, her voice a hypnotic whisper against the silence of the sleeping house. "You're a genius, Liam. What you're building is art. Just a little longer, my love." She celebrated his small victories and soothed his moments of frustration. She became the curator of his life, managing his meals, his schedule, and his finances, freeing his mind to focus solely on his creation. He saw her as his rock, his partner in ambition. He had no way of knowing that while she was bolstering his professional foundation, she was methodically laying dynamite at the foundation of his entire life. She was not his partner, she was a predator, patiently waiting for her prey to become too tired to notice the closing of the trap. The moment came on a Wednesday night, or rather, in the early hours of Thursday morning. A storm raged outside, the wind and rain lashing against the windows, mirroring the tempest in Liam's mind as he struggled with a critical design flaw. He had been awake for nearly 36 hours, and the lines on the page had begun to blur into an incomprehensible web. It was then that Isabella approached, not with coffee, but with a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She wore a look of serious purpose, her voice low and urgent. "Darling, I am so sorry to interrupt you at this hour," she began, her tone perfectly calibrated to convey both reluctance and necessity. "But I just got an email from our financial advisor. You know that exclusive real estate investment fund we've been trying to get into? The one that's projected to double our net worth in 5 years?" Liam nodded vaguely, his mind still on a cantilevered staircase. "Well, a spot just opened up, but the buy-in paperwork has to be couriered and filed by 9 a.m. It's an incredible opportunity, Liam. This is for us. This is for our future." She laid the portfolio on the one clear corner of the table. When she opened it, it revealed a sheaf of documents at least an inch thick, bristling with little yellow sticky tabs that said, "Sign here." The pages were dense with impenetrable financial jargon, charts, graphs, and endless paragraphs of fine print. "I know it looks like a lot," Isabella said breezily, "but it's all standard prospectus material. I've already read through it with the advisor. It's just the usual risk acknowledgments, asset declarations, and signature verifications." She began to flip through the pages, her polished fingernail tapping at each yellow tab. "It's a formality, really, but a very time-sensitive one." Liam stared at the documents, his sleep-deprived brain struggling to process the information. He saw words like fiduciary, indemnification, and capital gains, and his mind recoiled. It was another language, another world away from the elegant, logical universe of architectural design. He trusted Isabella. She was the expert in this realm of money and property. She was the one building their financial future while he built his legacy in steel and glass. She guided his hand to the first page. He signed. The next, he signed. Page after page, he scrawled his name. his signature growing sloppier with each one. And then, somewhere in the middle of the stack, nestled between a complex table of amortization schedules and a statement of investor eligibility, was another document. It looked different. It was simpler, with less text, but it was printed on a heavy, official-looking paper. The title at the top was clear: Quitclaim Deed. But the yellow sticky tab had been placed with surgical precision, covering the word deed, leaving only quitclaim visible. To a tired mind, it was just another piece of legalese. Isabella didn't pause on this page. Her voice remained smooth, unhurried. "And this is the asset transfer confirmation for the portfolio," she said, her finger pointing directly at the signature line at the bottom, far away from the title at the top. Liam's eyes barely scanned the page. He saw the address of the house, but in the context of an investment portfolio, he assumed it was a standard declaration of primary residence, a box to be checked. He didn't read the sentence above his name, the one that stated he, Liam Vance, did hereby remise, release, and forever quitclaim the property to Isabella Rossi. He picked up the pen. The ink flowed onto the paper, and with that single, thoughtless stroke, he gave away his mother's home, his childhood, his entire history. It was done. Isabella's smile was radiant. She closed the portfolio with a soft, final click. "There," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "It's done. Our future is secure. Now, I'll let you get back to your masterpiece." She took the portfolio and glided out of the room, leaving Liam to turn back to his blueprints, the architect completely unaware that the structure of his own family had just been condemned by his own hand. After the front door clicked shut, leaving Eleanor alone with the deafening echo of Isabella's ultimatum, a profound and terrible silence descended upon the house. For a long moment, Eleanor did not move. She stood on the threshold, the ghost of a cool breeze from the open door still on her skin, and felt the entire world tilt on an unseen axis. The first wave of emotion that crashed over her was not grief, but a white-hot, crystalline rage. It was a fury so pure and so potent it threatened to consume her. Her first instinct was to grab the phone, to dial Liam's number and unleash a torrent of accusations and heartbreak to force him to see the viper he had welcomed into their lives. She imagined the confrontation with Isabella, the shouting match, the shattering of porcelain, the catharsis of finally letting the monster out of its cage. She wanted to fight, to claw back what was hers, with all the righteous fury of a mother defending her nest. She took a step towards the phone, her hand trembling, her knuckles white. And then, she stopped. The librarian within her, the quiet, methodical woman who had spent a lifetime categorizing information and seeking the truth beneath the noise, took control. Rage was a fire, but fire was indiscriminate. It would burn the innocent along with the guilty. It would consume the very thing she was trying to save. She walked, not to the phone, but to the living room. She bypassed the cold white leather chair that Isabella had installed and sank into the worn familiarity of her reading chair in the corner. She closed her eyes and, instead of feeling, she began to think. She analyzed the situation with the cold, detached logic she would apply to a complex research problem. Fact 1. Isabella possessed a legally binding document signed by the co-owner of the property, her son. A legal battle would be an immediate uphill struggle, a public spectacle that would drain her savings and expose her family's private agony to the world. Isabella, a real estate professional, would be on her home turf, armed with lawyers and jargon. Eleanor would be portrayed as a confused, emotional old woman. Fact 2, and this was the most important variable, Liam. He was the fulcrum on which this entire tragedy balanced. He was not a villain, but a fool for love, a fool for trust, but her fool, her son. An open attack on Isabella would be an implicit attack on him, on his judgment, his intelligence, his choice of a wife. He would be forced into an impossible position, caught in the crossfire between the two women he loved. Guilt and shame would make him defensive. He would likely, in his confusion, defend his wife, further cementing the wedge Isabella had so expertly driven between them. In a direct confrontation, Eleanor realized with a chilling certainty she would not only lose her house, she would lose her son. Fact 3. Isabella's entire strategy was predicated on a specific narrative. In her carefully constructed world, Eleanor was already cast in the role of the difficult, jealous, slightly senile mother-in-law. Any show of anger, any accusation, any resistance from Eleanor would fit that script perfectly. Isabella was expecting a fight. She was prepared for it, had likely even rehearsed her lines. She wanted Eleanor to scream and cry and make a scene. It would validate everything she had ever whispered in Liam's ear. An emotional outburst was not just a losing strategy, it was walking willingly into Isabella's trap. The path forward became brutally clear. To win, Eleanor had to become the one thing her entire being railed against: weak. If Isabella had cast her in a role, then Eleanor would give the performance of a lifetime. She would not fight the narrative. She would inhabit it so completely that her enemy would be blinded by her own success. The rage did not dissipate. Instead, it underwent a strange alchemy. It cooled, hardened, and was banked deep inside her, transforming from a chaotic, destructive fire into a single, focused point of blue-hot energy. Her grief was real, her heartbreak profound, but from now on, they would be tools. They would be her costume and her camouflage. The very next day, the performance began. When Liam finally came to her, his face a mask of guilt and confusion after a long talk with his wife, he did not find the furious mother he was likely dreading. He found a woman who seemed to have aged a decade overnight. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a single, half-packed box of old teacups beside her. She didn't shout. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a bottomless, weary sadness. "I don't understand, Liam," she whispered, her voice fragile. I don't understand." She allowed him to stammer through his pathetic, pre-scripted explanation about needing to be a provider, about building a future, about how this was all just a legal formality to help them secure a loan. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "If this is what you and Isabella need," she said softly, "then that's what we'll do." She had never wounded him so deeply. With Isabella, she was even more effective. She became listless, compliant, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She would shuffle through the hallways, occasionally stopping to touch a piece of furniture with a lost expression. She would ask Isabella in a small, quavering voice if she was packing the right things, if she was being a bother. The performance was flawless. Isabella's confidence swelled into arrogance. She saw a defeated old woman and became careless. Her phone conversations with friends became more brazen, her tone more triumphant, believing Eleanor was either out of earshot or too lost in her grief to comprehend. But Eleanor comprehended everything. While her hands mindlessly wrapped a porcelain figurine in newspaper, her mind was a steel trap, cataloging every word, every smirk, every casual cruelty. She was a spy in her own home, gathering intelligence from behind a mask of sorrow. The silent war had begun. And 1 week later, while Isabella was out celebrating her victory with friends, Eleanor Vance put on her coat, walked 3 blocks to a convenience store, and purchased a prepaid, untraceable cell phone. That evening, she made her first call. It was to a man whose name she had retrieved from one of Richard's old address books. A private investigator, a man who specialized in uncovering the stories that people tried to bury. The man Eleanor called was named Frank Miller. He was a retired police detective turned private investigator, a man whose face looked like a roadmap of every difficult case he'd ever worked. He had been Richard's friend, a bond forged over years of early morning fishing trips where more was said in the silence than in conversation. When Eleanor called him, using the sterile, anonymous voice of the burner phone, she didn't have to say much. She mentioned Richard's name. She said she was in a unique and delicate kind of trouble, and he simply told her where and when to meet. They met in the periodicals room of the Hartford Public Library, a place where Eleanor felt the familiar armor of knowledge settle around her. It was her territory. Frank Miller, with his gruff demeanor and observant eyes, did not seem surprised by her composure. He was expecting tears, perhaps hysteria. Instead, Eleanor slid a thin folder across the table to him. Before contacting Frank, Eleanor had done what she did best. She had conducted research. The skills that had made her an exceptional librarian patience, a methodical mind, and an intimate understanding of how to follow the faintest trail of information were now repurposed for war. While feigning helplessness at home, she had spent her afternoons at the library, diving into public record databases, genealogy websites, and the deeper, archived corners of social media. She had started with the small inconsistencies, the frayed threads in the tapestry of lies Isabella had woven, the Vermont farmhouse, the estranged family, the sparse wedding guest list. She treated each lie as a search query. She ran property record searches in the Vermont county Isabella had mentioned. No one by the name of Rossi or any known associates had ever owned property there. She cross-referenced the names of the few friends who had attended the wedding, finding their social media profiles were all brand new, with very few connections, digital ghosts created to populate a fictional life. It wasn't much, but it was a pattern of absence, a carefully curated void where a real past should have been. She presented her findings to Frank, her voice even, her hands steady. Frank looked at her notes, then at her, and a slow look of deep respect dawned on his weary face. "Richard always said you were the smartest person he ever knew," he grumbled, a rare compliment. "All right, Eleanor, let's see who this ghost really island." Frank's resources were far greater than her own. He had access to databases that weren't public, a network of contacts who traded in information, and the instinct of a man who had spent 30 years looking for the lie in people's eyes. The first wall to crumble was the name itself. Isabella Rossi, it turned out, did not exist before the age of 28. Her social security number, however, did. It belonged to a Jennifer Peterson from Gary, Indiana, a woman with a juvenile record for petty fraud. With that one true name, the entire fragile facade of Isabella began to disintegrate. Frank started pulling on the thread of Jennifer Peterson, and a whole history of deception unraveled. Jennifer Peterson had legally changed her name to Isabella Rossi 3 years ago. Before that, she had been known, for a short time in Florida, as Sophia Flores. As Sophia, she had married a 65-year-old retired hotelier, a recent widower. The marriage lasted 8 months. The divorce records were sealed, but the property records were not. The man's beachfront condo, which he had owned for 20 years, was transferred to Sophia's name 2 months into the marriage as a gift. 6 months after the divorce, she sold it for a significant profit and vanished. Before she was Sophia Flores, she had been Chloe Dubois in Texas. As Chloe, she had entered into a business partnership with a wealthy, middle-aged tech entrepreneur who was struggling after a messy public breakup. She had charmed her way into his company and his life. 6 months later, the company declared a strange, sudden bankruptcy, while a series of offshore holding companies controlled by Chloe Dubois received a massive infusion of cash that exactly mirrored the company's liquid assets. The entrepreneur was ruined, and Chloe was gone. The pattern was terrifyingly clear, a masterclass in predatory opportunism. Each identity was a bespoke creation, tailored to the specific desires of her target. For the lonely widower in Florida, she was a nurturing, old-fashioned soul. For the tech mogul in Texas, she was a sharp, ambitious business partner. For Liam, the idealistic architect, she was a sophisticated real estate professional who spoke his language of aesthetics and value. She was a chameleon, a void that took the shape of whatever a man most desperately wanted to see. Frank compiled it all into a single thick dossier. It contained copies of marriage licenses under different names, property deeds, newspaper clippings about the failed tech company, and even a grainy photograph from a security camera in Florida showing Sophia with the hotelier. He had even managed to track down a disgruntled cousin of Jennifer Peterson from Indiana, who described a girl who was pathologically manipulative, who had practiced the art of the con since she was a teenager. Frank delivered the dossier to Eleanor during another clandestine meeting, this time in a quiet park. He slid the heavy envelope onto the bench between them. "She's a pro, Eleanor," he said, his voice grim. "A black widow. She bleeds them dry, legally if possible, and then moves on. Your son was next on the list. The house was just the grand prize." That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her room, the door locked, and opened the file. She spread the contents across her bed. Page after page, she saw the life's work of a sociopath. She saw the faces of the other men, their expressions ranging from happy to bewildered, men like her Liam, blinded by a carefully constructed fantasy. And then she came to the last page. It was a mugshot from Jennifer Peterson's juvenile arrest 16 years ago. The face was younger, the hair was different, but the eyes were the same. The cold, calculating, triumphant eyes that she saw every single day across her own kitchen table. The sight did not make her feel fear. It did not make her feel helpless. It filled her with a cold, righteous certainty. This was not just about her house anymore. This was about justice. She now held the truth in her hands, a weapon more powerful than any forged signature. And she was going to use it to burn Isabella's world to the ground. Liam existed in a fog of self-reproach and willful ignorance. He had accepted Isabella's version of events because the alternative was simply too monstrous to contemplate. He told himself that the seizure of his mother's home was a hard, but necessary, step towards building a future. A strategic, if brutal, financial maneuver. He saw Eleanor's quiet grief, and it felt like a stone in his gut. But he would soothe the ache by reminding himself of Isabella's logic, her reassurances that in the long run, this would be best for everyone. He was an architect of structures, and he tried to believe he was co-architect of a new, stronger family, even if the foundation was laid with his mother's heartache. He clung to the memory of the woman he had fallen in love with, the whirlwind of passion and validation, and chose to believe she was still there, somewhere beneath the new, harder edges that were beginning to show. But a lie, like a poorly designed building, cannot bear weight for long. The cracks began to show. Now that the house was legally hers, Isabella's performance as the doting daughter-in-law ceased. The energy required to maintain the illusion was no longer deemed necessary. The change was most apparent in her treatment of Eleanor. The gentle, patient tone she used in front of Liam was gone. In its place was a clipped impatience, a barely concealed disdain. Liam would walk into the kitchen to find Isabella watching Eleanor struggle to reach a high shelf, her arms crossed, a look of bored annoyance on her face. When she saw him, the look would vanish, replaced instantly with a bright smile as she rushed to help. "Oh, Mom, you should have asked me," she'd say, but Liam had seen that first, true expression, and it was cold as ice. He started noticing the small cruelties. Eleanor's mail would be left on the counter for days, while Isabella's was opened immediately. Her favorite television shows would be mysteriously erased from the DVR to make room for Isabella's. Each was a tiny act of aggression, a subtle assertion of dominance in the conquered territory. Her obsession with money, once framed as ambitious and savvy, now seemed ravenous. Their conversations were no longer about their future, but about their portfolio. She spoke of the house not as a home, but as an asset to be leveraged. She had contractors over to give quotes on renovations, not to make the space more comfortable for them as a family, but to maximize its resale value. "If we knock out this wall and put in a marble island, we can increase the asking price by at least 15%, she'd say, her eyes gleaming with a speculator's light. She pushed him relentlessly on the museum project, her interest in his artistic vision replaced by a stark fixation on the final payout. The woman who had once admired his soul now seemed to only admire his bank account. Love had been supplanted by arithmetic. The true moment of rupture, the event that shattered his carefully constructed denial, was about a box of books. Richard had been a collector of first edition poetry, his pride and joy a signed copy of a Robert Frost collection. The books were kept in a glass-fronted case in the study. One afternoon, Liam came home early to find the case empty. When he asked Isabella, she waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, honey, they were so musty. I packed them carefully in a sealed container and put them in the attic for safekeeping." Her answer seemed plausible, but a cold dread coiled in Liam's stomach. Later that evening, he went to take out the recycling bins, and through the translucent blue plastic, he saw a familiar, embossed leather spine. He tore the bag open. There they were. All of his father's books, his father's passion, his legacy, callously tossed out with old newspapers and junk mail, the signed Robert Frost volume lying face down on a greasy pizza box. It was not just careless. It was a desecration. It was the act of someone who saw a priceless history and saw only clutter. That single image broke the spell, but it was the phone call that damned her completely. A few days later, still reeling from the discovery of the books, Liam was working in his car in the driveway, reviewing some schematics on his laptop. His phone had died, so he was off the grid. Isabella, thinking he was still at the museum's site, was on the back patio, the sliding door left slightly ajar. Her voice, carried on the afternoon breeze, was unlike any version of her he had ever heard. It was sharp, coarse, and dripping with contemptuous triumph. "Of course he doesn't know." She laughed into her phone, a harsh, ugly sound. "He's an artist, Jessica. He sees the world he wants to see. I could tell him the sky was green, and he'd write me a sonnet about it." There was a pause. The old lady, she's practically a ghost already, shuffles around like she's lost, which, I guess, she island. The laugh came again, louder this time. "Don't you dare feel sorry for her. Business is business. The mark is the mark. You know the rules." Liam felt the blood drain from his face. "Mark?" The word hit him like a physical blow. "No, this is the biggest score yet. The house alone is a masterpiece of equity. Once his museum bonus comes in, I give it 6 months. He'll think we're planning a trip to Italy. I'll be planning a wire transfer to a bank in Belize." The final words struck him with the force of a physical impact. "God, it'll be a mess. He'll be heartbroken, blah, blah, blah. But I'll be sipping a mojito on a beach, and you know what? I will have earned it." Liam sat motionless in his car, the architectural drawings forgotten on the screen in front of him. The world did not spin, it simply ceased to exist. Every shared glance, every kiss, every whispered "I love you" replayed in his mind. But now they were grotesque, scenes from a horror film in which he was the witless, starring victim. The love he had felt for her, a love so vast it had defined his entire existence, curdled in an instant into a toxic sludge of revulsion and self-loathing. He had not just been deceived, he had been a willing accomplice. He had handed her the keys. He had ignored his mother's silent pain. He had signed the paper. A wave of nausea washed over him, the bitter taste of his own catastrophic foolishness. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his laptop and saw a stranger, a blind, pathetic fool who had allowed a predator to gut his family and had called it love. The awakening was not a gentle dawn. It was a violent, blinding explosion, and it had leveled everything. For hours, Liam sat in the driver's seat of his car, the world outside his windshield, muted and indistinct. The damning words he had overheard played on a continuous, tormenting loop in his mind. The mark, the score, I will have earned it. Each phrase was a fresh turn of the knife. The woman he loved did not exist. He was married to a phantom, a construct of his own desperate need for affection, a void expertly shaped to resemble a soulmate. In her place was a creature of pure, reptilian calculation. The shame of it all was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. It was the shame of the fool, the mark, the chump who had not only been played, but had eagerly handed over the keys to his own destruction. But beneath the shame was a deeper, more profound agony, the guilt of what he had done to his mother. He had been the weapon. His signature, his trust, his love, all had been turned against the one person who had only ever shown him unconditional devotion. He could not face Isabella. To look at her now would be to see the monster, and he knew he did not yet have the strength to hide his revulsion. There was only one person he could face, only one confession that mattered. He got out of the car, his legs unsteady, and walked back into the house that was no longer his. It felt alien, a stage set for a tragedy he had co-produced. He walked past the living room, past the study she had colonized, and up the stairs. He stopped outside his mother's bedroom door. Her room had become her last bastion, a small island of her own history in the ocean of Isabella's conquest. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, he knocked softly. Eleanor opened the door and saw her son, not the successful architect, not the confident newlywed, but the boy he had been at 10 years old, the one who had come to her after shattering a neighbor's window, his face pale with the knowledge of his own transgression. He was utterly broken. Before she could speak, He stumbled into the room and the words began to pour out of him, a chaotic, desperate flood of confession. He told her about the phone call, his voice cracking as he repeated the vile, triumphant words. He told her about the poetry books in the recycling, a symbol of a cruelty he could no longer ignore. And then he confessed the worst of it, the memory that would haunt him forever. He described the late night, the pressure of his work, the stack of papers, and the blind, exhausted trust with which he had signed everything she put in front of him. "I didn't even read it, Mom," he sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "It was all there, right in front of me, and I didn't see it. I was so arrogant. I was so happy to let her handle everything, to prove I wasn't just your little boy anymore." He sank to his knees on the floor, the full weight of his failure finally crushing him. "I gave her your home. I gave her Dad's home. I destroyed everything for a lie. Can you ever forgive me?" Eleanor listened. She stood in silence as her son's carefully constructed world detonated before her eyes. There was no flicker of triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." The rage she had banked so carefully deep inside did not stir. All she saw was her child, ravaged by a pain she knew all too well. When his sobs finally subsided into ragged gasps, she moved. She knelt down in front of him, the stiffness in her old joints protesting, and placed her hands on his trembling shoulders. "Look at me, Liam." He slowly raised his head, his eyes red and swollen. "This is not your fault," she said, her voice imbued with a quiet, unshakable authority. "You did not fail. You were targeted. She is a predator, and a predator does not hunt the weak. She hunts the strong, she hunts the good. She saw your kind heart, your trust, and your capacity to love, and she used it. She twists the best parts of people into weapons against them. That is her craft. You were not a fool. You were a victim of a master." Liam stared at her, bewildered by the absence of anger, by the presence of a strength he hadn't seen in months. It was then that Eleanor made a decision. It was time to let him in. It was time to form an alliance. "For the past month," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I have not been packing boxes. I have been building a case." She stood up and walked to her closet. From behind a stack of old hat boxes, she retrieved a thick manila folder. She sat on the edge of the bed and beckoned him to sit beside her. She opened the dossier Frank Miller had prepared. She showed him everything. The mugshot of a teenage Jennifer Peterson, the marriage certificate to the widower in Florida, the news clippings of the ruined tech company in Texas. Liam's eyes widened with each new piece of evidence. He was not just looking at the history of a con artist, he was looking at his own fate, narrowly avoided. The ghost of the man he could have become broke, humiliated, alone stared back at him from the file. He saw that his mother was not a victim, she was a general. She had been fighting a silent war while he had been living in a fool's paradise. A new feeling began to replace the shame, a cold, hard resolve. The architect in him, the builder, the planner, began to emerge from the wreckage. He looked at his mother, truly looked at her for the first time in months, and saw not a frail old woman, but the formidable, intelligent matriarch who had raised him. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice no longer a sob, but a low, steady question. "What's the plan?" Eleanor closed the folder. "We can't sue," she said. It's what she would expect. It would get dragged out in court, and she would find a way to spin it. No, a creature like this doesn't fear the law. She fears exposure. She thrives in the dark, weaving lies in secret. So we are going to drag her into the brightest, most public light imaginable. We are going to create a stage, and on that stage, everyone she has ever tried to impress, everyone she has fooled, is going to watch her one-woman show come to its final, humiliating end. Liam's role in this play, she explained, would be the most difficult. He had to go back downstairs. He had to kiss his wife. He had to pretend that he was still the loving, trusting, oblivious husband. He had to become a spy in his own marriage, a soldier behind enemy lines. Liam squared his shoulders. The boy who had knelt on the floor moments ago was gone. In his place was a man with a mission. "I'll do it," he said, his voice raw but firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the quiet sanctuary of that bedroom, amidst the wreckage of a family's trust, a powerful and unlikely alliance was forged. The war was no longer silent, and Eleanor Vance was no longer fighting it alone. The days that followed the confession were the most difficult of Liam's life. He was now an actor, playing the lead role in a twisted domestic drama of his own making. Every morning, he had to wake up next to Isabella, force a smile, and kiss the face of the woman who had methodically plotted his family's ruin. Every word of affection felt like ash in his mouth, every touch a violation. His life became a masterpiece of compartmentalization. The loving husband was a carefully constructed facade, and behind it, the real Liam, the grieving son and co-conspirator, was working with his mother, the silent general, to lay the most intricate trap he had ever designed. Their planning sessions were clandestine, held in the hushed stacks of the library or on park benches, their conversation masked by the noise of traffic and playing children. It was here that the architecture of their revenge took shape. Eleanor, with her calm, strategic mind, laid out the core principle. Isabella could not be defeated in a courtroom. She was too skilled at playing the victim, at twisting the truth. She had to be dismantled, piece by piece, in the court of public opinion, the very arena where she believed she reigned supreme. "She is a narcissist," Eleanor stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Her ego is her greatest weakness. We will not attack her fortress. We will build her a throne so high that her fall will be visible to everyone." It was Liam who suggested the specific design of the trap. "We'll throw a party," he said one afternoon, their heads bent over a library table. "A huge one, here, at the house. We'll call it a housewarming, a celebration of our new home." The irony was bitter, but the logic was perfect. The scene of the crime would become the scene of the judgment. They would invite everyone. Liam's colleagues from the firm, senior partners he wanted to impress. Old family friends who had known and respected Richard, people who remembered Eleanor as the strong, vibrant matriarch of the family. And, most importantly, Isabella's own circle of vapid, sycophantic friends, the very people whose admiration she craved. But a party was not enough. They needed bait. Irresistible, intoxicating bait that would appeal to her deepest, most insatiable hunger. It was Eleanor who devised the masterstroke. "You will tell her," she instructed Liam, "that you've been so impressed with her financial acumen that you've decided to put her in charge of everything. You are creating the Vance Family Trust, and you want to name her as the primary trustee." The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a promise not just of the house, but of the entire Vance legacy, Richard's investments, Eleanor's inheritance, Liam's future earnings, everything. To a creature like Isabella, it would be the ultimate validation, the final, total victory she had been working towards. "We will announce it at the party," Eleanor concluded. "A grand public declaration of her power. She will not be able to resist." Liam played his part with an actor's skill he never knew he possessed. He presented the idea of the party to Isabella one evening, his voice full of manufactured adoration. "You've done so much, my love," he said, taking her hands. "You've secured our future. You deserve a celebration. I want to show you off to the world, to show everyone the brilliant woman I married." Isabella, preening under the praise, agreed instantly. The thought of being the triumphant hostess in her new, magnificent home was a fantasy come to life. A few days later, Liam presented the bait. He sat her down, his expression one of utter seriousness and devotion. "Isabella," he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. My mother, she's not getting any younger. I need to know our future is secure, and you are the only one I trust to do it. I've had my lawyer draw up the preliminary papers for a new Vance Family Trust. It puts everything under one umbrella, and I want you to be the one who manages it. You will be the sole trustee." He watched her face as the words sank in. He saw the flicker of surprise, followed by a wave of avarice so pure and potent it was almost visible. She was trying to conceal her elation, to feign a humble gratitude, but he could see the triumphant gleam in her eyes. She had not just won the battle, she had won the entire war. "Oh, Liam," she breathed, throwing her arms around him. "I'm speechless. I won't let you down." He held her, the feeling of her arms around him making his skin crawl, and whispered, "We'll announce it at the party. It will be the perfect moment." From that point on, Isabella was a woman possessed. She threw herself into planning the party with a manic energy, obsessed with every detail: the caterer, the flowers, the exact vintage of champagne. Her guard was not just down, it was completely dismantled. She was so blinded by the brilliance of her impending coronation that she failed to notice the shadows gathering in the corners. She didn't notice the quiet, shared glances between Liam and his mother. She didn't notice the new, hard resolve in Eleanor's eyes. While Liam played the loving fool, Eleanor worked in the background with Frank Miller. They were no longer just gathering information. They were preparing munitions. The dossier was transformed into a cold, clinical slideshow. The audio of Isabella's damning phone call was cleaned and amplified by a specialist, every venomous word now perfectly, horribly clear. Eleanor's own lawyer, a quiet, shrewd man who had handled the Vance family's affairs for decades, was brought into the circle of trust, ensuring their grand reveal was not just dramatic, but legally airtight. He prepared the fraud lawsuit and annulment papers, ready to be served when the time was right. The night of the party arrived. The house was transformed, glittering with fairy lights and filled with the scent of expensive flowers. The caterers moved with quiet efficiency, and the sound of a string quartet warming up drifted from the garden. Isabella was upstairs, taking a final look in the mirror, a vision in a silk dress, the triumphant queen surveying her castle. Downstairs, in the grand foyer, Liam adjusted his tie, his hands cold. He caught his mother's eye across the room. She stood by the fireplace, a picture of quiet dignity, in a simple gray dress. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look that communicated everything: their shared secret, their shared pain, and their shared, unbending purpose. The guests were beginning to arrive. The stage was set. The trap was baited. The curtain was about to rise on Isabella's final performance. The party was a resounding success, which is to say, it was exactly the glittering, superficial spectacle Isabella had envisioned. The house, her house, was filled to capacity with a curated collection of beautiful, important people. Music from a string quartet drifted through the open French doors to the garden, champagne flowed like water, and the air buzzed with polite laughter and influential conversations. Isabella was in her element, a radiant star in her own solar system. She moved through the rooms with the effortless grace of a monarch, her silk dress shimmering under the chandelier light. She was the perfect hostess, her smile never faltering, her charm a tangible force. She would touch the arm of a senior partner from Liam's firm, murmuring a clever compliment, then turn to an old family friend of the Vances and speak with feigned reverence about Richard's memory. Liam, ever at her side, played his part to perfection, his face a mask of uxorious pride. Isabella felt a sense of invincibility, a heady rush of absolute triumph. She had won. The house, the money, the man, the status, it was all hers. She was basking in the warm glow of her victory, completely unaware that she was standing at the epicenter of a perfectly designed detonation. At precisely 9:30, when the party had reached its crescendo, Liam stepped onto the low, makeshift stage near the fireplace. He tapped a spoon gently against his champagne flute. The light chatter subsided, a wave of expectant silence washing over the room. Isabella glided to his side, her hand possessively on his arm, her face glowing with anticipation. This was her moment, the public anointing she so richly deserved. Eleanor watched from the edge of the crowd, a small, still point in the swirling room, her expression unreadable. "Good evening, everyone," Liam began, his voice amplified slightly by a discreet microphone. It was steady, resonant, betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. "Thank you all so much for coming. It means the world to Isabella and me to have you here, in our home, to celebrate a new chapter in our lives." Isabella squeezed his arm, her smile widening. "Family and the foundations we build upon it have been on my mind a lot lately," Liam continued, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on his wife. "Trust, honesty, knowing exactly who you're building that future with. My wife, Isabella, has taught me so much about the importance of due diligence. And so tonight, we wanted to make an announcement. But first, I'd like to share a small recording that I believe truly captures the ambition and the vision that Isabella has brought to our family. Isabella's expression flickered with confusion for a fraction of a second, but she held her smile, assuming it was some kind of sentimental, pre-recorded message. Liam gave a nearly imperceptible nod to a man standing near the audio-visual equipment, Frank Miller, dressed impeccably as a member of the catering staff. And then it began. A voice filled the speakers, a voice that was Isabella's, but stripped of all its polished charm. It was coarse, ugly, and loud. He actually believes I love him. The man is a sweet, pathetic puppy dog. A collective gasp went through the room. Isabella's face went white, her smile frozen in a rictus of horror. The recording continued, each word a sledgehammer blow to her carefully constructed reality. The old lady is a ghost. The mark is the mark. You know the rules. People began to turn and stare at her, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Her friends, the ones she had been laughing with moments before, took a reflexive step back. This is the biggest score yet. He'll think we're building a nursery. I'm building an exit strategy. I'll be sipping a mojito on a beach, and you know what? I will have earned it. The audio clicked off, leaving a silence that was more damning than any sound. Isabella stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly agape, her eyes wide with panic. Before she could form a word, before she could scream that it was a lie, a large white screen smoothly descended from a hidden recess in the ceiling behind her. An image flared to life, projected for all to see. It was a police mugshot of a sullen, dark-haired teenager. Beneath it, the words, Jennifer Peterson, Gary, Indiana, juvenile arrest, fraud. The next slide appeared. A sunny wedding photo of a different man, an older man, beaming next to a blonde woman, Chloe Dubois, Houston, Texas. Below it, a newspaper headline, Tech mogul forced into bankruptcy. Another slide, another man, another wedding. Sofia Flores, Miami, Florida. Below it, a copy of a property deed, transferring a multi-million-dollar condo to her name. Slide after slide, the evidence mounted, a cold, irrefutable timeline of her predatory life, of the identities she had stolen and the lives she had ruined. The room erupted in a maelstrom of angry, disgusted whispers. Isabella's composure finally shattered. "No," she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. "This is insane. It's a lie. Liam, tell them it's a lie." But Liam didn't look at her. He looked at the crowd, his face a portrait of somber resolution. Isabella spun around, her eyes wild, searching for an ally, for an escape route, but she was trapped in a sea of hostile faces. Her fantasy had become a nightmare. Her adoring audience had become her jury and her judge. As her hysterics reached a fever pitch, Eleanor calmly walked onto the stage and took the microphone from her son's hand. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. The quiet authority in her tone cut through the chaos, silencing the room instantly. She looked directly at the unraveling woman before her. "You were right about one thing, Jennifer," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. "Business is business, but you made a fatal miscalculation. You assumed this family was just another asset to be liquidated." She gestured to the screen, where the mugshot of Jennifer Peterson had reappeared. "You are a thief of histories. You prey on goodness, and you monetize trust. But your story, the one you write over and over again with new names and new victims, ends tonight. It ends here, in this house. The one you were so certain you had won." Isabella stared at her, her face a mask of pure hatred and defeated rage. She was exposed. She was ruined. The trap had closed. For a moment after Eleanor's final words, a stunned, absolute silence held the room captive. The only sound was the faint, cheerful melody of the string quartet from the garden, a grotesque counterpoint to the scene of utter social devastation. Then, the silence shattered. Isabella, her face a contorted mask of fury, emitted a raw, guttural scream. It was a sound of pure, animalistic rage. "You bitch!" She shrieked, her voice cracking, lunging towards Eleanor. But she never reached her. Two of Richard's old friends, men in their 70s who had known Eleanor for decades, instinctively moved to intercept her, forming a protective wall in front of the woman they respected. Their presence, their silent, unmovable disapproval, seemed to enrage Isabella even more. Chows erupted. Guests began to surge towards the exits, parents shielding their children's eyes, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. The party, so meticulously planned, dissolved into a panicked exodus. Isabella's so-called friends were the first to disappear, melting into the departing crowd like smoke, their loyalty as ephemeral as the champagne bubbles they had been sipping. Amidst the pandemonium, Isabella stood trapped, a cornered predator, spitting venom at anyone who met her gaze. "You'll all pay for this," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Liam, you weak, pathetic mama's boy. You'll regret this. I'll sue you for everything." Her threats, once so potent in their quiet calculation, were now just the impotent shrieking of a deposed tyrant. It was then that a new figure emerged, moving through the panicked crowd with a calm, deliberate purpose that parted the sea of people before him. He was a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his expression impassive. Liam and Eleanor watched as Isabella's frantic eyes landed on him. For a wild, insane moment, a flicker of hope appeared on her face. It was Mr. Davies, the notary, the man who had been her instrument of victory. Perhaps he was here to save her, to attest to the legality of her claim. He stopped directly in front of her. "You see?" Isabella gestured wildly at him. "He's a notary. He saw the signature. It's legal. The house is mine." Eleanor stepped forward, her calm a stark contrast to Isabella's hysteria. "Isabella," she said, her voice carrying a note of pity, "you are correct. You have met Mr. Davies before. When you brought him to my home to serve me with a notice of eviction." She paused, letting the memory hang in the air. "Tonight, he is here to return the favor. He is not just a notary public. Mr. Davies is a senior litigation partner at Hartford's most respected law firm, and for the past 30 years, he has been my family's attorney." The blood drained from Isabella's face. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, revealing the full, horrifying scope of how thoroughly she had been outplayed. This wasn't a spontaneous emotional outburst. This was a calculated, legally fortified execution. Mr. Davies did not smile. He simply opened the leather portfolio he was carrying and produced a thick sheaf of documents. His voice was cold, formal, and carried across the now quieter room. "Jennifer Peterson, also known as Isabella Rossi, also known as Sophia Flores, also known as Chloe Dubois," he began, the recitation of her false names, a public stripping of her identity. "I am here tonight to serve you with the following legal actions on behalf of my clients, Eleanor Vance and Liam Vance." He held up the first document. "This is a civil lawsuit for multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It seeks the immediate and unequivocal voiding of the fraudulent quitclaim deed, as well as punitive damages." He placed it in her trembling hand and produced another. "This is a petition for the annulment of your marriage to Liam Vance on the grounds of fraudulent inducement and false identity, which, when granted, will legally establish that this marriage never existed." He placed the second document on top of the first. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "this is a temporary restraining order, effective immediately, prohibiting you from coming within 500 yards of this property, or of contacting Eleanor Vance or Liam Vance through any means. A violation of this order will result in your immediate arrest." He placed the final document into her hand. The papers shook, then slipped from her grasp, scattering at her feet like dead leaves. She stared at them, then up at Eleanor, and finally at Liam. The hatred in her eyes was terrifying, but it was hollow, impotent. She had nothing left, no power, no credibility, no identity. At a subtle signal from Frank Miller, 2 large men dressed as valet staff appeared at her side. They did not touch her, but their presence was an unmistakable command. It was over. With a final, choked sob of pure, defeated rage, Isabella turned and allowed herself to be escorted out of the house. The guests watched in silence as the woman who had, an hour before, been the glittering queen of the castle was marched out the front door, stripped of everything, and cast out into the night. Slowly, the remaining guests began to depart, offering quiet, respectful words of support to Eleanor and Liam on their way out. The house, so recently filled with noise and life, grew cavernously silent. All that remained was the debris of a battlefield, half-empty glasses, discarded napkins, and the lingering scent of fear and betrayal. Eleanor and Liam stood alone in the center of the living room, the grand stage now empty. The victory was total, but the air was thick with the ghosts of the battle. It was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment of profound, somber relief. Liam looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a gratitude and respect that ran deeper than words. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Eleanor looked around the room, at the home her husband had built, the home she had almost lost, the home that was finally, truly hers again. "No, Liam," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not over. Now, we begin again." The weeks that followed the party were quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the tense, watchful silence of a Cold War, but the peaceful, restorative silence that follows a storm. The legal proceedings against Jennifer Peterson, or Isabella Rossi, unfolded in the background, a distant and clinical affair. The annulment was granted swiftly, the fraudulent deed was voided, and a litany of civil and criminal charges ensured she would not be preying on another family for a very long time. But the true aftermath, the real healing, took place within the walls of the house itself. Together, Eleanor and Liam undertook a quiet, systematic purge. They boxed up every trace of Isabella's existence, the cold leather furniture, the soulless modern art, the expensive clothes still hanging in the closet. Each item they removed felt like an act of cleansing, of reclaiming their space. They brought Richard's old armchair back from the attic, its familiar indentations a comforting welcome. They rehung the photographs on the mantelpiece. They worked side by side in the garden, pulling up weeds, their shared rhythmic labor, a form of unspoken therapy. Their relationship had been reforged. The old, comfortable assumptions were gone, replaced by a new, profound honesty. They talked for hours, not just about the ordeal they had survived, but about everything. They had faced the worst of human nature together, and in doing so, had rediscovered the best of their own. About 2 months after the party, Eleanor decided it was finally time to clean out Richard's study. It was a task she had avoided for years, a final letting go she hadn't been ready for. But now, it felt right. It was the last room to be reclaimed, the last ghost to be lovingly put to rest. As she sorted through 2 decades of old financial records in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, her fingers brushed against a small, locked metal box she had never seen before. It was tucked far in the back, behind a stack of old tax returns. Her curiosity piqued. She found the small key for it in Richard's old desk drawer, in a tiny envelope labeled, "For Emergencies." She opened the box. Inside were a few old photographs and a thick, sealed envelope. On the front, in her husband's familiar, steady handwriting, were 2 words, "My Eleanor." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letter was dated just 6 months before he had passed away. His words, calm and loving, reached out to her from across the years. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I can only hope that you are sitting in the garden, enjoying the roses. I am writing to you about something that has been weighing on my mind. My old business partner, George Findlay, went through a terrible ordeal last year. He was taken in by a very clever, very ruthless young woman who swindled him out of his retirement savings. The woman's name was Jennifer Peterson." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. George was devastated, not just by the loss of the money, but by the betrayal. He told me about her methods, her charm, her ability to become exactly what a person needed. And he told me something that chilled me to the bone. She had a particular interest in families with single, good-hearted sons. It made me think of our Liam. I know our boy. He has your kind soul and my trusting nature. He is a wonderful man, and therefore a perfect target." The letter continued, and with each sentence, Eleanor's world tilted once more, but this time, in a way that was both shocking and profoundly beautiful. "I knew I could not protect him from every heartache in the world," Richard wrote. "But I could, and I did, protect the foundations of the life we built together. So, I want you to know this, my love, for your own peace of mind. 5 years ago, I worked with Mr. Davies to establish an irrevocable family trust. This house, our primary investments, everything of significant value, was placed securely within it. The terms are ironclad. As the sole primary trustee, your signature is the only one on this earth that can authorize the sale or transfer of any asset within that trust. Liam's signature, on its own, is legally meaningless. The house was never in danger. It has been safe all along. Eleanor lowered the letter, her mind reeling. The quitclaim deed had been a worthless piece of paper from the very moment Liam had signed it. The entire battle she had fought, the silent war, the elaborate trap she had been fighting a ghost, defending a fortress that had never been breached. A slow smile spread across her face, followed by a single, silent tear that was not for sorrow, but for the overwhelming love of the man who was still taking care of her, still protecting his family from beyond the grave. She realized then that her victory was so much greater than she had ever imagined. The fight had never been about the property. The house was just brick and mortar, already secured by Richard's foresight. The real battle had been for her son's soul. Her fight was to save Liam from a life of ruin, to pull him back from the abyss of a predator's design, to expose the truth not for a deed, but for his heart. That was a victory no legal trust could ever guarantee. That was a victory she had to win on her own. She looked at her husband's letter, a final gift of his quiet strength, and then around the peaceful, sunlit room. And she thought of the moral of her long, painful story. Don't ever underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking, they are not yielding. They are observing, they are planning, and they are remembering. In that silence, they are sharpening the truth into a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Thank you for listening. Justice, sometimes, is not about the loud verdict in a courtroom, but about the quiet, unassailable truth that was there all along. We invite you to join us again for the next chapter.